Emma Sullivan's battered Ford pickup truck coughed to life at 5:30 a.m., the same time it had for the past 3 years. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly before her headlights as she drove toward Nellis Air Force Base, her blonde hair pulled back in the same tight bun that had become her uniform of invisibility. At 35, she looked older than her years, worn down by memories that most people couldn't imagine carrying. The basement office where she worked smelled like industrial cleaner and forgotten dreams. Young pilots would strut past her desk, calling her paper lady with the casual cruelty of those who'd never known real combat. They'd toss their flight plans at her with smirks, making jokes about women and filing systems while she organized their futures in alphabetical order. "Hey, paper lady," called out Brad Mitchell, the 24-year-old son of Admiral Mitchell, as he dropped his paperwork on her desk without looking at her. "File this under future ace." That's ACE, in case you need help spelling it. The other? Cadets laughed. Emma said nothing, just picked up the papers with steady hands that had once guided an F-22 Raptor through Syrian airspace at 40,000 feet. None of them knew she had logged over 4,000 combat hours, or that her call sign Lightning was still whispered with reverence in certain Pentagon corridors. Her apartment in suburban Las Vegas contained one bedroom, no television, and a piano that hadn't been tuned since she'd rescued it from a garage sale. The bookshelf sagged under aerospace engineering texts and quantum physics journals, remnants of the MIT doctorate she'd earned at 23, back when her IQ of 165 meant something more than how quickly she could alphabetize personnel files. Mrs. Thompson from next door brought cookies every Sunday, always with the same concern. "You should get out more, dear. Maybe meet someone nice." Emma would smile, accept the cookies, and never mention that the last someone nice she'd trusted had tried to sell her position to enemy forces for $50 million. In her breast pocket, she carried 3 items that never left her side. A folded photograph worn soft at the creases, a simple silver ring that no longer fit any finger that mattered, and a twisted piece of metal no bigger than a quarter. Debris from an F-22 Raptor that had exploded over Syrian airspace one night. 10 years ago, 10 years earlier, Captain Emma Sullivan had stood in the briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base, her flight suit immaculate, her eyes sharp with the confidence of America's youngest female Top Gun graduate. The mission board showed Operation Desert Shield 2 in red letters, a classified strike against enemy installations threatening Allied forces. Her squadron of 6 F-22 Raptors represented the pinnacle of American air superiority, and she led them with natural authority. Daniel Hayes, her wingman, and the man whose engagement ring waited in her quarters had grinned at her from across the room. "Ready to make history, Lightning?" She'd touched his hand briefly, a violation of protocol she allowed herself because, after tonight, after the mission, she planned to say yes to the question he'd been asking for months. The mission had gone sideways in ways that still haunted her dreams. Daniel's voice through the radio. "Lightning, this is Eagle 2. They offered $50 million, nothing personal. The betrayal had hit harder than any G-force as she watched her wingman guide enemy fighters toward her position. Training took over where emotion failed, her thumb finding the weapon's release as tears blurred her vision. The explosion that followed lit up the Syrian night, debris from Daniel's Raptor striking her right engine and sending her limping back to base on one turbine and a heart that would never fully function again. The court-martial that followed was a masterpiece of military injustice. Colonel Marcus Hayes, Daniel's older brother, led the investigation with single-minded determination to clear his brother's name. The flight recorder had mysteriously vanished, mission footage suffered convenient corruption, and Emma's testimony about the betrayal was dismissed as combat stress. They couldn't prove murder, but they didn't need to. Her wings were clipped, her commission ended, her name erased from the rolls of honor. The night she left Edwards, she packed only 3 things. The engagement ring she'd never wear, a photo of her squadron from better days, and a piece of Daniel's Raptor that had embedded itself in her fuselage. Now, as she filed paperwork for pilots who would never know what she'd sacrificed, Emma had built a life of aggressive mundanity. Each day, identical to the last, each insult absorbed in silence, each dismissal accepted with the patience of someone who had already died once at 30,000 feet. But in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the intermission, the admiral's son. Brad Mitchell arrived at Nellis with all the swagger of someone who'd never faced real adversity. His father, Admiral Mitchell, had pulled strings to get him into the elite training program, and Brad wore his privilege like expensive cologne, impossible to ignore and slightly nauseating up close. He noticed Emma on his first day, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. While other base personnel showed proper deference to the Admiral's son, the quiet woman in the basement filing office barely acknowledged his presence. To someone accustomed to automatic respect, Emma's indifference felt like a personal insult. "You know who my father is?" he asked during his second week, leaning over her desk with practiced intimidation. "Yes, sir," Emma replied without looking. Up from her paperwork, "Admiral Richard Mitchell, Pacific Fleet Commander." "Then you know I could have you transferred to some godforsaken outpost with one phone call." Emma finally met his eyes, her gaze steady and unimpressed. "I'm sure you could, sir. Will that be all?" The dismissal stung more than any comeback could have. Brad had expected fear, groveling, or at least acknowledgement of his power. Instead, he got the polite indifference of someone filing his existence under unimportant. Colonel Marcus Hayes had transferred to Nellis 3 years after his brother's death, carrying grief that had curdled into bitterness. He'd taken an immediate dislike to Emma, though he couldn't articulate why. Something about her quiet competence reminded him of Daniel, and that reminder felt like salt in an old wound. When Brad began complaining about the unfriendly filing clerk, Hayes saw an opportunity to flex his authority. He started calling Emma to his office for increasingly trivial infractions. A misfiled report here, a delayed response there. Each meeting was a masterclass in death by 1,000 cuts. "Sullivan, this is the 3rd mistake this month," he'd say, knowing full well that Brad and his followers had been submitting deliberately incorrect paperwork. "Maybe this job is too complicated for you." Emma would stand at attention, absorbing his vitriol while remembering how she'd once outflown his brother in every training exercise they'd shared. "I'll correct it immediately, sir." The harassment campaign escalated with military precision. Brad recruited other cadets to his cause, each one eager to prove their loyalty to the Admiral's son by showing contempt for the basement paper pusher. Coffee appeared on her desk with mysterious regularity, always spilled in exactly the right spot to ruin whatever she was working on. Files went missing, reappearing days later in wrong locations with notes about female incompetence. Sarah Martinez, one of the few female pilots in training, watched the campaign with growing unease. She'd tried to speak up once, suggesting that maybe they were being too hard on Emma, but Brad's dismissive laughter made it clear that defending the paper lady was career suicide. "You're not thinking of joining the Losers Club, are you, Martinez?" Brad had asked, with mock concern. "Daddy Admiral doesn't like officers who can't tell winners from dead weight." Sarah stayed silent after that, but she began paying closer attention to Emma Sullivan. There was something about the way the older woman moved, a precision and awareness that didn't match her humble position. When Emma thought no one was looking, Sarah caught glimpses of someone else entirely. Someone who belonged in a cockpit, not a basement. The breakthrough came during week 3, when Brad discovered fragments of Emma's service record through his father's connections. Not the classified parts, those were buried too deep, but enough to piece together a narrative that served his purposes. Holy shit, his voice carried across the mess hall where 500 personnel were eating lunch. She was a pilot, a failed pilot. Emma Sullivan killed her own wingman. The whispers spread faster than wildfire. By evening, someone had spray-painted "murderer" across her truck's windshield in red letters that looked like blood in the parking lot lights. Emma cleaned it off with the same methodical movements she'd used to clean her F-22's canopy before dawn patrols. Each stroke erased evidence while leaving the memory intact. Mrs. Thompson appeared with a thermos of coffee and a worried expression. "Those boys don't know what they're talking about, dear," the elderly woman said firmly. "I've been cleaning this base for 30 years and I know quality when I see it. You've got more class in your little finger than the lot of them combined." It was the first kindness Emma had received in months, and it nearly broke her. Carefully maintained composure. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That means more than you know. You just remember, sometimes the people who talk the loudest are the ones with the least to say." As Emma drove home that night, she found herself gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. The twisted metal in her pocket seemed heavier than usual, a reminder that she'd survived worse betrayals than playground bullying. But something was building inside her chest, not anger exactly, but a recognition that silence had its limits. In her apartment mirror, she studied her reflection. Somewhere behind the tired eyes and careful invisibility was the woman who'd once been called the best pilot in the Air Force, the woman who'd saved thousands of lives with split-second decisions in hostile airspace. Maybe it was time to remember who she used to be. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for a Friday in March, exactly 10 years and 6 days after the night over Syria. Emma had submitted her resignation letter that morning, planning to disappear before sunset like just another ghost in the Nevada desert. Her dress uniform hung in the closet, unworn for 3 years, the torn insignia hidden in her pocket like a shameful secret. 500 guests filled the auditorium, generals, admirals, defense contractors, and journalists, eager to document the next generation of American air superiority. Emma sat in her assigned seat in the back corner, invisible as always, watching young pilots receive recognition she'd once earned but could no longer claim. Brad Mitchell stood among the honor graduates, his chest puffed with unearned pride. His father sat in the VIP section, nodding approvingly as his son's name was called for various awards. The admiral's influence had smoothed every rough edge, ensuring his boy's path to success remained obstacle-free. Colonel Hayes took the microphone with the satisfaction of a man about to settle an old score. "Before we begin celebrating these outstanding young aviators, I want to address something that's been weighing on my mind." The spotlight found Emma before she could move, trapping her in its merciless glare. 500 faces turned toward her corner like sunflowers following light. "We have someone here who doesn't deserve to wear our uniform," Hayes continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Emma Sullivan. Some of you may have heard the stories. Discharged for friendly fire, killed her own wingman, out of incompetence or worse. Now she files papers because that's all she's good for." The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through the assembly like wind through wheat. Brad stood up first, his voice cutting through the whispers. "Take it off! Take it off!" Others joined the chant, building until the entire auditorium thundered with their demand. Emma felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening,
like ice on a frozen lake finally giving way to spring.
Hayes descended from the stage with the deliberate stride of a man who'd waited 10 years for this moment. He reached her seat as the chanting peaked, his hand grabbing her insignia with practiced violence. The fabric tore with a sound that somehow carried over 500 voices. "You don't belong here," he spat, throwing the torn patch at her feet. "Take off that uniform and go back to filing paperwork where women like you belong." Blood filled Emma's mouth from where she'd bitten through her lip. She stood slowly, meeting his eyes with a gaze that had once tracked enemy fighters through Syrian airspace. The chanting continued, but something in her expression made Hayes step backward involuntarily. Then she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression, more like the baring of teeth before a strike. For the first time in 3 years, Emma Sullivan looked like someone who'd once been called Lightning. "You want me to take off my uniform?" she asked, her voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "Fine." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd once operated complex targeting systems under extreme stress. In seconds, she'd connected to the base's public address system through a maintenance protocol most people had forgotten existed. "This is Captain Emma Sullivan, call sign Lightning," her voice echoed through speakers across Nellis Air Force Base. 10 years
ago, I was falsely accused of killing my wingman.
Today, I have proof of what really happened that night over Syria. The auditorium fell silent. Hayes's face drained of color as he recognized the implications of what was about to unfold. Emma's fingers moved across her phone screen with surgical precision. What you're about to hear is authenticated black box recorder footage, recently declassified by Pentagon directive. Daniel Hayes's voice filled the auditorium, clear and damning. "Russian control, this is Eagle 2. Lightning's position, confirmed. 50 million wire transfer, confirmed. Guiding hostiles to intercept." The silence that followed was deafening. 500 people held their breath as the truth rewrote everything they thought they knew. Hayes staggered backward, his face cycling, through disbelief, horror, and recognition of his own destruction. "My wingman betrayed his country for money," Emma continued, her voice steady as bedrock. "I stopped him from compromising 4 forward operating bases and killing 20,000 American servicemen. For this, I was court-martialed, stripped of
rank, and exiled to your basement." Brad Mitchell looked like he might vomit.
His carefully constructed world of privilege and assumed superiority was crumbling in real time, broadcast to an audience that included his father and every person whose opinion mattered to his career. Emma picked up the torn insignia from the height floor, holding it like evidence at a trial. "You asked me to take off my uniform. I will. But understand what you're discarding. The service record of someone who chose honor over career, truth over comfort, and country over personal safety." She began unbuttoning her dress jacket with deliberate movements, each unfastened button marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Underneath, she wore a simple white t-shirt that somehow looked more dignified than all of the ribbons and decorations surrounding her. "The sky doesn't care about your uniforms or your politics or your comfortable lies," she said, folding the jacket carefully.
"It only recognizes those brave enough to claim it." Admiral Mitchell stood up in the VIP section, his face purple with rage and embarrassment. "This is outrageous! Security, arrest this woman for what?" Emma interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster like a blade. "For telling the truth?
For surviving betrayal while your son participates in character assassination? She walked toward the exit, her departure somehow more commanding than any entrance. At the door, she turned back to face the assembly one final time. The twisted metal I carry as a reminder came from Eagle 2's wreckage, proof that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who destroy us most completely. But destruction isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning. The auditorium doors closed behind her with quiet finality, leaving 500 people to contemplate the difference between reputation and character, between privilege and honor, between wearing a uniform and earning one. In the parking lot, Mrs. Thompson waited by Emma's truck with tears in her eyes and a thermos of coffee. "I always knew you were special, child," she said through her emotion. Emma hugged her. The first human contact she'd allowed herself since Syria. Just Emma, Mrs. Thompson. I was only ever trying to be just Emma. The call that changed everything. 3 in the morning brought clarity that felt like hypothermia. Emma sat on her apartment floor, back against the wall, sorting through 10 years of carefully maintained invisibility. 2 cardboard boxes held everything that mattered. Aerospace textbooks she'd never open again, a coffee thermos worn smooth by daily use, the calendar from her office wall marking 3 years of identical days. The photograph of her squadron smiled up from the pile, 6 faces bright with purpose, 5 of them now dead, Rodriguez and Williams in Afghanistan, Chen and Martinez in Iraq, Daniel by her own hand. Only lightning remained, and she was about to extinguish herself too. Her resignation letter lay in pieces on the hardwood floor, torn into precise strips during a moment of anger she couldn't quite remember. The torn dress uniform hung on her bedroom door like a shed skin, no longer needed for the person she was becoming. Her phone buzzed against the floor. Unknown number. 033 hours. She almost ignored it, expecting a drunk cadet's final harassment. Then answered on the 5th ring. "Captain Sullivan, this is General Patricia Morrison, Pentagon." The voice carried authority that cut through Emma's exhaustion. She said nothing, waiting. "I know what happened at Nellis tonight. I also know the truth about Syria. Daniel Hayes was selling coordinates to enemy forces. You saved 4 bases that night." The words hung in the darkness like afterburner flame. Emma found her voice, cracked and unused to honesty. "It doesn't matter now, ma'am." "It does. Check your email." The video file downloaded in seconds that felt like years. Black box recorder footage, authenticated by Pentagon cryptography. Daniel's voice filled her apartment for the first time in a decade, confessing to treason with casual greed. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the phone. 10 years of doubt, self-hatred, and public shame erased by 30 seconds of truth she'd been denied.
"Why now?" she whispered. "Because we need you. The French have requested our best pilot for a joint training demonstration. That pilot is still you, despite what official records claim. I can't fly anymore. They took my wings. Officially, yes.
Unofficially, there's a Rafale waiting in Hangar 7 with your name on it." The French insisted on lightning. They remember Syria differently than we pretended to. Emma looked at the twisted metal in her hand, heard Daniel's voice again. Not the betrayal, but from before, when they'd been young and invincible. "Promise me, whatever happens, keep flying. The sky is where you belong." A promise to a traitor. Seemed like bitter irony, but maybe promises were about who we choose to be, not who we make them to. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "Demonstration flight is tomorrow at 0900. NATO observers, international press, and every pilot at Nellis who watched you walk out of that auditorium tonight. Emma stood up, her reflection in the dark window, showing someone she hadn't seen in years, not the broken woman who'd filed papers in a basement, but the pilot who'd once made enemy aces change course just by appearing on their radar. General Morrison, tell the French that lightning accepts. By 0400 hours, she'd memorized every system specification of the Rafale fighter. The French Delta Wing design was different from her beloved Raptor, but still a Predator, still designed for those who belonged above the earth. By 0500 she'd showered and stood before her mirror in civilian clothes that felt like armor. The twisted metal went on to her keychain, no longer a weight, but a talisman. The engagement ring found its way onto her right hand for the first time since Syria, not for Daniel, but for the promise to keep flying that had outlived his betrayal. Hangar 7 sat apart from the main complex, accessed through a security gate. That opened to a code that shouldn't have worked, but did. General Morrison's influence reaching across continents to give Lightning her wings back. The Rafale waited like a sleeping dragon, its delta wings catching the first hints of dawn. Two French pilots in flight suits looked up from their pre-flight inspection, their faces shifting from suspicion to recognition to something approaching awe. "Madame, you are Lightning? The Lightning from Syria?" She nodded, economical with truth. "Captain Emma Sullivan, I believe you're expecting me." The senior pilot, graying at the temples but sharp-eyed, extended his hand. "Colonel Dubois, it is an honor. We studied your tactics at St. Cyr. The vertical scissors at Angels 40 was magnificent. News traveled fast on a military base. By Woe 700, whispers raced through corridors and across flight lines. The paper lady in Hangar 7 with the French near a Rafale. Impossible. Brad Mitchell arrived breathless and indignant, his coterie of followers close behind. "What's she doing here?" "This is restricted airspace." Emma continued her pre-flight check, running her hands along the Rafale's skin with the reverence of a pianist returning to music after years of silence. "Sullivan, I'm talking to you." She didn't acknowledge him, instead discussing fuel loads. With Colonel Dubois in fluent French, another skill the basement hadn't required. The conversation flowed like water, technical precision wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. By 0800, organized chaos filled the main briefing room as Colonel Hayes stood before 50 NATO dignitaries, his presentation on American air superiority polished to propaganda perfection. "Today you'll witness our finest pilots demonstrate why Nellis remains the premier air combat training facility in the world." The door opened with quiet authority. Emma entered in a flight suit that fit like memory, helmet under one arm, her step carrying the measured confidence of someone who'd faced death at Mark II and negotiated acceptable terms. "Sullivan, what the hell do you think you're—" She cut him off with silence, walking to the front of the room with the purposeful stride that had once carried her across carrier decks and into cockpits most pilots only dreamed of entering. "Colonel." Hayes, her voice carried without volume, pitched to penetrate jet engines and chaos. "I'm here for the demonstration flight." His face mottled from red to purple, 10 years of rage focusing into this moment.
"You're not authorized to..." The main screen flickered to life. General Morrison's face appeared in high definition, her stars prominent, her expression granite. "She is now. Captain Sullivan will fly the Rafale for our NATO allies. Gentlemen."
"You're about to witness something special." The room held its breath. Emma had brought her laptop, military grade, encrypted, loaded with a single file that would rewrite history. She connected it to the briefing room system with movements. Practiced in countless mission debriefs, the truth was about to set her free. Vindication at 40,000 feet. Emma's fingers moved across the laptop keyboard with the same precision she'd once used to lock onto targets in hostile airspace. The briefing room's main screen came alive with official Pentagon seals and classification, headers that made several NATO officers lean forward in recognition. "What you're about to hear," Emma announced to the silent assembly, "is authenticated black box recorder footage recently declassified under Pentagon Directive 2025 Alpha 7. Colonel Hayes tried to interrupt, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is highly irregular." "General Morrison doesn't have authority to—" "I have all the authority I need," Morrison's voice cut through the speakers with the weight of 3 decades in uniform. "Play the recording, Captain Sullivan." Daniel Hayes's voice filled the briefing.
Room, clear and damning as a confession. Russian control. This is Eagle 2. Lightning's position confirmed. 50 million wire transfer confirmed. Guiding hostiles to intercept. The silence that followed felt like the pause between lightning and
thunder. 50 NATO officers processed the implications while Colonel Hayes's world collapsed in real time. The brother he'd spent 10 years defending had been a traitor, and the woman he'd destroyed had been a hero. Brad Mitchell sat down hard, his face cycling through the stages of recognition. Every joke, every insult, every moment of casual cruelty
had been directed at someone who'd saved thousands of American lives while he was still learning to tie his shoes.
Admiral Mitchell stood up in the VIP section, his carefully maintained composure fracturing. "This is preposterous. Even if that recording is authentic, it doesn't excuse..." "Excuse what?" Emma's voice cut through his bluster like a blade through silk. "Excuse stopping your son from tormenting a veteran. Excuse surviving betrayal while maintaining operational security for a decade." She let the recording play again, watching faces change as the full weight of truth settled over the room. Sarah Martinez, the young female pilot who'd witnessed the harassment campaign, looked sick with shame and recognition. "My wingman sold his country for $50 million, Emma continued, her voice steady as bedrock. "I stopped him from compromising 4 forward operating bases and exposing 20,000 American service members to enemy fire. For this service, I was court-martialed, stripped of rank, and exiled to file papers in your basement." Colonel Dubois stood up from his seat among the French delegation, his accented English carrying across the room. "Captain Sullivan, we have studied your engagement over Syria at our war college. The tactical brilliance of your response under impossible circumstances saved not just American lives, but French pilots operating in the same theater." Emma nodded acknowledgement, then turned her attention back to Hayes, whose face had drained.
"Of all color, your brother confessed to treason on authenticated military recording equipment."
Every word he spoke was monitored and recorded by systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of betrayal he committed. Hayes tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound that might have been his brother's name. The investigation that followed was compromised from the beginning. General Morrison's voice continued through the speakers. Key evidence disappeared, testimony was suppressed, and the truth was buried to protect the reputation of a dead traitor and his family. Emma walked to the front of the room, carrying herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd found their footing after years of being knocked down. "You asked me to take off my uniform last night." "I did. But understand what you discarded, the service record of someone who chose honor over career, truth over comfort, and country over personal safety. The NATO observers were filming now, recognizing they were witnessing not just a demonstration, but a resurrection. The story would spread through international military circles within hours, the American pilot who'd been buried alive and climbed out of her own grave. Brad Mitchell finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. We didn't know." How were we supposed to know? Emma's gaze settled on him with the weight of accumulated wisdom. You weren't supposed to know anything except how to treat another human being with basic dignity. You failed that test completely. Admiral Mitchell's face had progressed from purple to ash-grey as he calculated the career implications for his family. His son's treatment of an American hero would be career suicide in the current political climate, and his own influence had enabled the harassment. "Captain Sullivan," he began, his tone shifting to damage control, "if there's anything we can do to make amends—" "There is," Emma cut him off. "You can watch." She turned to address the room one final time before heading to the flight line. "In 30 minutes, I'll demonstrate what your basement filing clerk is actually capable of. You'll see why the French requested lightning specifically, and why some truths are worth waiting 10 years to tell." As she walked toward the exit, Sarah Martinez stood up from her seat among the junior officers. "Captain Sullivan," she called.
Out, her voice carrying a mixture of respect and apology. "Thank you for your service. The real service."
Emma paused at the door, looking back at the young woman who might have spoken up earlier, but chose survival over solidarity. "Lieutenant Martinez, the sky doesn't care about politics or convenience. It only recognizes courage when courage is required." The briefing room doors closed behind her, leaving 50 NATO officers and a collection of shamed Americans to contemplate the difference between reputation and character. Outside, the Nevada sun was climbing toward its daily throne, painting the desert in shades of gold and possibility. The Rafale waited in Hangar 7 like a promise kept after too many broken ones. Mrs. Thompson appeared beside the hangar with a thermos of coffee and eyes bright with tears of vindication. "I knew it," she whispered fiercely. 30 years cleaning this base, and I've never seen anyone carry themselves like you do. Now they'll all see what I saw." Emma accepted the coffee with hands that no longer trembled, steady now with purpose. "Just watch me fly, Mrs. Thompson. After 10 years of being grounded, I'm finally going home." The twisted metal on her keychain caught the morning light as she walked toward the Rafale, no longer a weight, but a reminder that from destruction comes the choice to rebuild or remain rubble. Lightning was about to reclaim her sky. The flight line at Nellis buzzed with electric tension as words spread through the base like wildfire. The paper lady wasn't just going to fly, she was Lightning, the pilot whose name was whispered in. Reverence through special operations circles. Mechanics, ground crew, and off-duty personnel found excuses to drift toward the runway, drawn by the kind of anticipation that preceded historic moments. Emma walked to the Rafale with the purposeful stride she'd abandoned 3 years ago, her flight suit fitting like armor tailored by angels. The French Delta Wing fighter gleamed in the desert sun, $45 million of European engineering waiting to dance with an American pilot who'd been presumed dead. Colonel Dubois performed his final systems check alongside her. His movements precise but reverent. "Madame Lightning, the Rafale is different from your F-22, but she responds to confidence. Trust her, and she will trust you." Emma's hands moved over the controls with muscle memory that never truly dies, fingers finding switches and toggles that spoke the universal language of flight. The cockpit felt like coming home after years of exile, surrounded by instruments that translated human will into physics, defying reality. 500 observers pressed against the fence line, their faces a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Colonel Hayes stood rigid among them, his world already collapsed, but his professional obligation keeping him upright. Brad Mitchell looked ready to disappear into the earth, his father beside him calculating the career damage this would inflict on their family name. Sarah Martinez held her breath, finally understanding why Emma's movements had always seemed different from other ground personnel. The older woman carried herself like someone who belonged 3 miles above the earth, temporarily grounded but never truly earthbound. Tower, this is Lightning requesting clearance for unrestricted climb. The controller's voice caught, recognizing the call sign from Legend rather than current roster. Lightning, cleared for unrestricted climb. Welcome back. Emma brought the engines to life, their whine building to the roar that had haunted her dreams for a decade. The Rafale vibrated with barely contained power, 40,000 pounds of thrust waiting to translate her intentions into motion that would rewrite the observer's understanding of what was possible. She released the brakes. The Rafale leaped from the runway like a creature freed from chains, rotating at minimum distance with gear retracting before most pilots would have reached rotation speed. Emma pulled the stick back hard, pointing the nose at the sun, afterburners painting blue diamonds against the Nevada sky. 10,000 feet in 30 seconds, 20,000 in a minute. The observers below became ants, then specks, then nothing. But memory as she climbed toward the edge of breathable atmosphere. At 45,000 feet, where the sky turned indigo and the earth curved beneath her wings, Emma began to fly. Not the careful, prescribed movements of an air show, but the lethal ballet of someone who danced with death and lead. She rolled inverted, pulling negative Gs that would have grayed out lesser pilots, then transitioned into a cobra maneuver that stood the Rafale on its tail like a rearing horse. The French fighter responded to her touch like a thoroughbred, recognizing a master's hand, performing beyond its published specifications because she demanded nothing less. Every maneuver was a word in the language only fighter pilots truly spoke, sentences that spelled out a decade of suppressed skill. The crowd below had stopped breathing. Brad Mitchell stared skyward with his mouth open, his arrogance evaporating, like morning dew under afterburner heat. Colonel Hayes gripped the fence until his knuckles went white, watching the woman he'd tried to destroy demonstrate why she'd once been called the best pilot in the Air Force. Emma pushed the Rafale too. Mach 1.8, the sonic boom rolling across Nellis like thunder from a clear sky. The shockwave knocked several observers to their knees, including Hayes, whose symbolic collapse felt like justice served at the speed of sound. She performed maneuvers so dangerous most pilots wouldn't attempt them below 20,000 feet, executing them at 15,000 with microsecond precision that turned catastrophic risk into choreographed beauty. The falling leaf, the Herbst maneuver, the mongoose, each evolution a reminder that some people were born to exist in 3 dimensions while others merely watched from 2. The NATO officers filmed with phones and professional cameras, recognizing they were witnessing history, not just a demonstration, but a resurrection broadcast to an audience that would carry this story to every Air Force in the free world. For her finale, Emma brought the Rafale down for a low pass that would have earned anyone else a court-martial. 50 feet above the runway at 600 knots, the jet's wake throwing up dust devils that sent hats flying and knocked Colonel Hayes flat on his back where afterburner exhaust put him. She barrel-rolled during the pass, a final flourish that spoke of absolute mastery, then pulled up into a climbing turn that bled speed with mathematical precision. The landing that D followed was so smooth the tires barely whispered against concrete, a surgeon's touch applied to 20 tons of fighter aircraft. Emma taxied back to the hangar in silence, engines winding down from scream to whisper. The canopy opened to desert heat and 500 people afraid to make a sound. She climbed down the ladder with the same economy of movement she'd used. To organize their files, removed her helmet, and let her blonde hair fall free in the morning breeze. The walk across the tarmac took forever and no time at all, each step carrying her past a decade of humiliation toward whatever came next. General Morrison had arrived in person, her helicopter touching down during Emma's aerial display. She stood at the front of the crowd, stars glinting in the sun, voice carrying across the flight line without amplification. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed Captain Emma Sullivan, callsign Lightning, the first woman to achieve ace status in the United States Air Force. 73 combat missions, 6 confirmed air-to-air victories. The pilot who saved 20,000 American lives by preventing the compromise of 4 forward operating bases in Syria. She paused, letting the weight settle over the assembly like a blanket of truth too heavy to ignore. A pilot we failed, but who never
failed us.
The journalists surged forward, a wave of questions and cameras that broke against Emma's raised hand, like water against stone. They stopped, as if hitting an invisible wall, recognizing authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with presence. Emma looked directly at Colonel Hayes, who knelt in the dust where her jet wash had put him, then at Brad Mitchell, whose face cycled through shame, awe, and something that might have been the birth of humility. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd found truth at 40,000 feet. You asked me to take off my uniform. She touched the flight suit over her heart. I did. Underneath was something you never understood, never earned honor. Not the kind that comes with rank or family names, but the kind you carry when no one's watching, when the world calls you a murderer and you know the truth but stay silent to protect secrets bigger than yourself. She removed the twisted metal from her keychain, placed it carefully on a nearby table beside her helmet. This belongs to the Air Force. But the sky belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. The basement office looked smaller than Emma remembered, though she'd left it only hours before. Her calendar still hung on the wall, 3 years of identical days marked in careful boxes. The thermos sat on her desk next to a stack of flight plans she'd never file again. Emma packed nothing except the calendar and a single sheet of paper, on which she wrote, "For the next dreamer who needs to remember, the sky waits for no one and forgives everyone." She left the note on top of a pristine Air Force manual, a beacon for whoever claimed this desk next. The news cycle devoured the story with predictable hunger. Within 6 hours, footage of Lightning's return had been viewed 18 million times across social media platforms. The tagline wrote itself, "Paper Lady reveals. She's America's greatest fighter pilot." Brad Mitchell was expelled from the flight program within 72 hours. His father's influence, considerable though it was, proved insufficient to overcome the shame of publicly tormenting an American hero. The admiral himself faced a formal reprimand and early retirement, as the Pentagon distanced itself from the family's spectacular fall from grace. Brad found work filing paperwork at a supply depot in Alaska, learning humility through the same mundane tasks he'd mocked. The irony wasn't lost on him, every day spent organizing other people's achievements, while his own dreams froze in the Arctic air. The cold helped somehow, made the shame feel like something he could endure rather than something that would consume him. Colonel Marcus Hayes faced court-martial for conduct unbecoming and conspiracy to conceal evidence of his brother's treason. The 10-year sentence felt like justice served cold but satisfying. His final statement to the military tribunal was brief. "I destroyed an innocent woman to protect a guilty man's memory. I have dishonored everything this uniform represents." Sarah Martinez requested a transfer to NASA's pilot training program, inspired by watching someone refuse to let the system define their limitations. Before leaving Nellis, She visited Emma's old basement office, now occupied by an eager young airman who'd found the note about dreamers and sky. The torn insignia had been framed beside it, creating a shrine to persistence. The international response surprised everyone except those who understood how small the community of elite pilots really was. Colonel Dubois wrote a formal letter to the Pentagon, copied to NATO Command, requesting that Captain Sullivan be offered a position training French pilots in advanced tactical maneuvers. Similar requests arrived from Germany, Britain, and Israel within the week. Emma Sullivan became Professor Sullivan at MIT, teaching aerospace engineering to young women who reminded her of herself before Syria, before Betrayal, before the world tried to convince her she didn't belong in the sky. Her first lecture drew standing room only, students and faculty cramming into the hall to see the woman who'd made a Raphael dance like a leaf in the wind. She opened not with war stories, but with equations, the mathematical poetry that made flight possible. Today, she said, marking Bernoulli's equation on the board, we learn about lift, the force that takes something heavy and broken and refuses to let it stay grounded. Her apartment in Cambridge had exposed brick walls working, radiators and a piano that stayed tuned. The walls were covered not with photos of her past, but of her students' futures, young women holding model aircraft they'd designed, acceptance letters to NASA, pilot wings earned through determination she'd helped nurture. The twisted metal from Daniel's Raptor became a keychain again, no longer a weight, but a reminder that from destruction comes the choice to rebuild or remain rubble. She wore it every day, the soft clicking against her office keys, a percussion of memory that no longer hurt. 6 months into her new life, an email arrived that made her laugh. The first genuine laughter in a decade. Professor Sullivan, I got into Navy flight school. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. I chose Phoenix as my call sign. It seemed appropriate. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez. Emma printed the email, pinned it to her wall among the constellation of other success stories. That evening, she played her piano for the first time in years, a melody that soared and dipped like a Raphael in capable hands. 3 years after her resurrection at Nellis, Emma stood before a classroom full of bright-eyed MIT students, their faces reflecting the same hunger for flight that had once driven her to excellence. Outside, Boston's autumn painted the world in shades of change and possibility. Who can tell me why the F-22 Raptor was considered the pinnacle of air superiority? She asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd actually flown one.
In combat. A young woman in the front row raised her hand eagerly. Because of its stealth capabilities and maneuverability, Professor Sullivan. Partially correct, Jennifer, but the real answer is because it was designed by people who understood
that physics and human will are dancing partners, not adversaries. The best aircraft in the world is useless without someone brave enough to push its limitations. The students scribbled notes, but Emma could see some of them weren't writing down her words. They were studying her, trying to understand how someone could survive betrayal, disgrace, and resurrection while maintaining the kind of quiet strength that filled rooms without effort. Her office had become an unofficial museum of futures she'd helped launch. Patches from units around the world covered one wall, sent by former students who'd taken her lessons into cockpits across 6 continents. Wedding invitations from pilots who'd married fellow aviators, understanding the sky's seduction. Photos from graduation ceremonies where young women received wings Emma had helped them earn. The basement at Nellis had a new occupant, someone young and eager who'd found the note about dreamers and sky, framed it beside the torn insignia as a reminder that greatness often comes disguised as ordinary paperwork. Sometimes Colonel
Dubois would visit from France, sharing coffee and stories about the morning an American woman reminded everyone why they'd chosen to fly.
She could have destroyed them all, he'd always say, had every right to. Instead, she just flew. Emma's story had spread through military aviation like contrails across clear sky, not as gossip, but as gospel. The pilot who was betrayed, destroyed, humiliated and buried, who chose to resurrect herself not for revenge, but for the simple truth that birds weren't meant for basements. Young pilots at Nellis started a tradition. Before their first solo flight, they'd touch the fence where Emma had stood, bloody-lipped but unbroken, and remember that honor isn't what others give you, but what you carry when they take everything else. The last time anyone saw Emma touch an aircraft was at an air show where one of her former students flew lead for the Thunderbirds. She placed her palm against the F-16's skin, closed her eyes and smiled. Those watching said she seemed to glow, as if the jet were charging her like a battery, or perhaps she was charging it. When asked if she missed flying, she'd look at the young woman in the cockpit, her student, her legacy, and say, "I never stopped. I just learned to fly through others." Dr. Emma Sullivan, Professor of Aerospace Engineering at MIT, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, awarded retroactively, and holder of the Congressional Medal of Honor for actions above and beyond the call of duty, kept office hours every Tuesday and Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m. Students would line up outside her door, not just for academic help, but for something rarer. The wisdom that comes from surviving your own destruction and choosing to build something beautiful from the rubble. On her desk, between photos of successful students and letters from pilots serving around the world, sat a small piece of twisted metal on a simple keychain. Visitors sometimes asked about it. A reminder, she'd say simply, that the strongest wings are forged in the storms we survive alone, but the most beautiful flights are those we inspire in others. The engagement ring had long since been sold, the money donated to a scholarship fund for female pilots. The photograph of her old squadron stayed in a drawer, faces frozen in time before loss rewrote their stories. But the twisted metal remained, clicking softly against her keys with each step. A percussion of memory transformed from pain into purpose. Emma Sullivan had been told to take off her uniform and she'd complied. But beneath the fabric wasn't weakness or shame. It was tungsten steel, forged in bureaucracy's furnace, wings that bureaucracy couldn't clip, and a spirit that understood the difference between falling and flying was simply the choice to spread your arms and trust the sky to catch you. On quiet evenings in Cambridge, she'd stand on her apartment's small balcony, watching planes trace paths between stars. The twisted metal would catch the light, and she'd remember Daniel's voice. Not the betrayal, but from before, when they'd been young and invincible. "Promise me, whatever happens, keep flying." She'd kept that promise in ways he never could have imagined, teaching others to soar while her own feet remained firmly planted on academic ground. Some battles, she'd learned, are won not with power, but with dignity. Some enemies are defeated not by destroying them, but by becoming something they could never imagine. The sky still called to her sometimes, but Emma had found peace in knowing that she'd left it in capable hands. Her students were her squadron now, each graduation another victory against gravity and prejudice. They sent her videos from their deployments, patches from their units, invitations to ceremonies where they received recognition she'd helped them earn. Lightning had come home, not to the cockpit she'd lost, but to the purpose she'd found. And in teaching others to fly, she'd discovered the most powerful truth of all. The greatest pilots aren't remembered for what they achieved alone, but for what they inspired in others. The twisted metal clicked one more time against her keys as she locked her office for the night. Tomorrow would bring new students, new dreams, new futures to launch into the endless sky. Emma Sullivan walked into the Boston evening, her reflection in the glass doors showing not a broken pilot, but a woman who'd learned that sometimes the most important flights are the ones that carry others to heights you'll never reach yourself. The sky belonged to her students now, and that was exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed Emma's incredible journey from humiliation to triumph, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. We share amazing real-life stories of ordinary people who refuse to let circumstances define them. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever faced a situation where someone underestimated you? Share your story in the comments. What did you think of Emma's transformation from paper lady to lightning? Let us know which part of her story resonated with you the most. Your engagement helps us bring you more inspiring stories like this one. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Until next time, remember, sometimes the people who seem the quietest have the most powerful stories to tell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.